The power reverse is one of the most interesting appurtenances on the modern steam engine. The mechanism is so simple in its design, but so complex in its operation that it is pure engineering elegance. This is obviously a shop-made device with the internals patterned after the Alco Model G or H reversing valve. Your original concern was the amount of air being passed through the exhaust port when the valve is centered. We observed the same issue when we pressurized the valve. The airflow passing through the valve and other places was well beyond what we'd expect to see. Once we started breaking down the valve, we removed the crank and found that the keyway was damaged and that there was a 5/16 Allen head bolt used to anchor the crank to the shaft. There was also 5 to 10 degrees of lost motion because of this wear. Eventually, the bolt would have sheared with the force being applied to it from the quadrant. In addition to the wear, the crank is not centered with the valve. This will cause your quadrant to have limited stroke in one direction. They compensated for this mistake by rotating the stop sleeve ahead by the amount of the mistake. This will need to be corrected if your valve is to operate the way it was designed. Once we had the valve disassembled, we discovered that the main shaft was undersized and the grease hole was completely inaccessible. Not only was it in a bad place, it was completely plugged with congealed engine oil and other contaminants. The grease should be acting as a secondary seal for air on the main shaft, but since the shaft was dry and the grease hole was plugged, this wasn't happening. The main shaft is 10/1000 undersize, which will allow movement that will further the wear on the shaft at an ever-increasing rate. Moving on to the valve itself. The measurements of the parts are exactly the same as the Alco version that we built, so if you ever need to reconstruct the valve, you won't have any trouble finding the original dimensions. The valve faces are worn, but not as much as we had expected to see. The big problem is the way the valve is attached to the main shaft. Alco does not attach the valve to the shaft so it can float on the face. This prevents any wear or out of roundness affecting the mating surfaces. The spring keeps pressure on the back side of the valve to keep the fit tight. The way this valve is designed, there's no way the spring can keep these two surfaces tight with the shaft being 10/1000 undersize. Every time you operate the quadrant, you're forcing the valve seats apart with that 10/1000 of an inch play. We're going to have to figure out a way to get this closer to the Alco design if your reverser is to have a long life. There are other issues with the way the valve is designed and put together, but the items that we discussed earlier are the ones that should be fixed if the valve is to operate reliably. I'll keep you informed as we progress through the repair, but I wanted to give you a heads up of what we found so far.